see who, by the way, has read this very thin but very dense book. Yes,
So
yes,
I
yes.
just got
Okay.
it. But
Okay.
Jerry, I have to tell you something. I
Yes,
You remember Yossi, my grandson?
of course.
He is a uh, he's at Ohio State, and I
Mhm.
mentioned your class, and I said, "Would you like to join?" And he says to me, "Is it Bernard Henry Levy?" I said, "Yes." He says he's coming to Ohio State on Monday, and
Wow.
he was there
Wow.
2 days ago, and Yossi went to hear him.
Oh, you fat.
Yeah.
I've never heard him in person. I'd like to do that.
There was an article in Wall Street Journal about him. I can't find it. One of these,
Mhm.
maybe before next week, I'll clean up there and I'll find it. And
So for the few of you who weren't with us the last week, just a little bit about they call him BHL is his abbreviation, Bernard Henri Levy. He's a public intellectual, a philosopher, a war correspondent, a journalist, a prolific author. He's also written screenplays. I'm leaving something. Film as well and documentaries. He's really a Renaissance man, a proud Zionist, and one of the new, they call them in France, the new philosophers, the ones that, after post-war, the only alternative to the Gaullists that were Marxists. And in the early 70s, mid 70s, he and a number of French philosophers said, let's chart a different path. We don't have to go all the way to Marxism, but we can move from de Gaulle and the right wing, and they came up with quote unquote the new philosophy, critical of Jean-Paul Sartre, critical of Marxism. They really in a weird way it reminded me of when Clinton was president and he was part of the Democratic Leadership Council, which was kind of a midway between left and right. And I'm probably doing them a disservice, but the new philosophers were of that ilk, and he's probably the most famous of all of them. He's written a number of books. I've read four now. I recommend. They're dense. They're relatively short. They're relatively inexpensive because they're almost always on paperback. But I find myself having to read them. You know, I'll tend to read each paragraph two or three times to make sure I know what the hell he's talking about. And Israel Alone was the book that he wrote. He went on October 8th, the day after the massacre, immediately to Israel and immediately to the south, to the Gaza envelope. He had spent a lot of time in Israel since the 67 war. And he particularly was enamored with the south near the envelope, quote unquote. So he knew these kibbutzim, and he knew Sderot, and he knew the people there who, as we all know, ironically, were some of the most pacifist, peace-loving, peace-promoting Israelis. And Dafka, they were the ones who were massacred so savagely. So the heart of the book was at least promulgated by his trip to the South, and then he takes off on some philosophical bent. So what I wanted to do was walk through some of the book and have a conversation. Don't worry if you haven't read it. I encourage you to, pick it up. I understand that the library at B'nai Shern has some copies. At least Rabbi Foster said that they were thinking about doing that. If not, it's probably not in the library yet because it just came out. But I know Barnes and Noble has it, and of course you can get pretty much everything in life from Amazon. The first chapter is called Pogrom. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about what is a pogrom. After what happened in Amsterdam, a lot of people are using it, and a lot of people are adafka going away from using it. So we should talk a little bit about the etymology and the history. A pogrom is a Russian word. It means to demolish violently, to wreak havoc. And historically, they were the violent attacks by the local non-Jews against the Jewish community, particularly in the Russian Empire, not joined by police necessarily, but allowed to happen by the police and encouraged by the church, by the Russian Orthodox Church. The first riot that was labeled a pogrom was in Odessa in 1821. It came into common usage in the 1880s after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. 1881 to 1884, there were tens of thousands of Jews killed in a pogrom. Pogroms aren't just killing sprees. They're very similar to what happened on October 7th. Rapes, looting, savage beatings, and of course, people getting killed as well. Right after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, Ukrainian nationalists, ironic, Polish officials, and the Russian Red Army all participated in a pogrom. It was in Belarus, what the Russians call Belarusia, White Russia. In the late 70s, 78, 79 time, when I went to the Soviet Union to meet dissidents and refuseniks, I particularly went to Belarus. The capital is Minsk, where one of my grandfathers grew up. So after the Civil War, after the Russian Revolution, 1917, Ukrainians, Poles, and Russians all participated in a pogrom. Tens of thousands of Jews were killed between 1918 and 1920. So it's got a lineage. A pogrom is really what happened in Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. An organized mob set out to violently hurt, maim, kill, and loot Jews and Jewish businesses. Even during the war, there were still pogroms. 1941 is one of the most infamous ones. The Romanian military units, they were allowed to do this by the German officers, but the Germans didn't do it. It was the Romanians who killed 8,000 Jews in one day. And even after the war, there were still pogroms. In 46, Poles killed 42 and wounded 50 or 60 in Poland after false rumors about a Jew kidnapping a Christian child for quote unquote ritual purposes. So unfortunately, these things have been around for centuries, very recently. And for Henri Levy and for others, calling what happened on October 7th a pogrom, I think is absolutely realistic. What's interesting, and then I want to pause for a little bit, these pogroms, their early history actually led to a mass migration of Jews in the hundreds of thousands to DP camps, displaced person camps, after World War II. And the fear of pogroms led and motivated Jews leaving post-war Europe. So what I like about history is you connect the dots. The anti-Semitism that was allowed to happen in Russia and Poland and Romania and the rest of Eastern Europe, one, killed, but two, so scared the Jews, even post-war, that they ended up saying, we're out of here. And many of them came to the West, Western Europe, and to the US. And some of them who couldn't get a visa elsewhere ended up in pre-state Palestine and then Israel. So that's the full circle. So what I want to ask you, I kind of answered my own question, was October 7th a pogrom? Well, I want to know, because it's in the news since October 7th. Does it matter what we call it? And that's not just a rhetorical question. As far as, Hasbara and, dealing with the non-Jewish community, the media, elected officials, does calling it a pogrom help or hurt? Anybody, just unmute and
I think it depends on what you know about history. In other words, the Jews who are knowledgeable about the pogroms in Russia and the other countries, it means one thing. To other people, I mean, it's like the word genocide. We're throwing words around. We're throwing words around like Holocaust, and they mean different things. Well, all words mean different things to different people. But the sensitivity that you have to a word is based on what your background and what you know. If you don't know the history,
yeah. Go ahead, David.
I was just going to throw in that and it sort of builds on what Sheila just said. I think it's fine from a Jewish perspective to call what happened, fine is the wrong word. I mean, it's a horror that happened, but to use the word pogrom is a decent description because you have an action that was organized. It was, I wouldn't even call it a mob. It was obviously more of a military group, if you will, paramilitary group. And particularly important, I think, is that it was encouraged by an authority, which is Hamas, which was an authority in Gaza. I think Jews, at least many Jews, understand it that way. And I think that's a legitimate way to understand it. And I think, Jerry, that's what you described. On the other hand, I see people throwing around that word in connection with what just happened in Amsterdam, which was in fact condemned by the authorities. I think maybe we have to be careful because I think, as Sheila said, we are ironically seeing the word genocide thrown as an accusation against us for something that's not remotely a genocide. I think we have to be careful about the words we use, and if we use them, we shouldn't assume that everybody knows what they mean, and maybe we need to explain when we use them.
I think it's a really good point.
A more accurate word would be massacre.
A massacre in
because there was nobody standing on the sidelines watching it happen like you described in Romania, or you described it went on in Russia. This was a massacre. This was not necessarily a mob. It was a paramilitary action because they had been trained to do what they did, and they massacred innocent people. And that is really the description or the best interpretation by, say, Webster of what the word massacre stands for.
And what David mentioned about Amsterdam, I've been looking at, one of my portfolios in the position I've just taken with the Federation here is to, God help me, try to come up with a way to address and combat anti-Semitism. I'll let you know if I find that. So one of the things I've been doing is poring over media reports, partly about Amsterdam. And there was a backlash, partly because people were calling it a pogrom. There was also, I think, a concerted effort on behalf of Al Jazeera and other outlets to make sure that that Israelis were blamed for it, and it's far more complicated than just that. But I think you're right. David, using the words has to be really precise, because then they lose their currency if we call everything a genocide, everything apartheid, everything a pogrom. I want to read something from the book. I think he like I said, he has very dense prose, but he can also wax poetic even about terrible things. So this is when Levy first gets to Israel, like I said, he landed the day after October 7th, early on October 8th, and he went immediately to the Gaza envelope, to Be'eri and Kfar Aza and Sderot. He said, and even though I did not arrive on the scene until after the very first reports on Israeli media, even though the teams from Zaka, that's the NGO whose task it is to locate missing body parts, they're mostly all very observant, and they have a terrible task, and they take it very, very seriously of picking up every skin fragment so that the bodies can be buried with as much of the body, even if it's quote unquote in pieces, as possible. So even though the teams from Zaka, the sacred task is to locate missing body parts so the deceased can be given a decent Jewish burial, had come through before me and removed most of the corpses, I'll never forget my first impressions. The smell of sour milk that filled the bullet-pocked, blasted, half-burned houses, the contents of their kitchen cabinets scattered in the rooms as if blown away by a hurricane, the neatly laid out streets lined with pretty houses with their shrubs intact, but empty of birdsong and human voices, or the consistent accounts of survivors and rescuers who recounted how the dead were collected, some of them decapitated and dismembered, others burned, others riddled with bullets and their hands torn to shreds as if they had fought until they dropped. Or finally, the vegetable storage shed where unidentified body parts that had just been collected were stacked in a small pile of flesh, indistinct except for the stench. I don't even know if the Nova exhibit has come to Cleveland. Has it? The exhibit? Okay, so Debbie and I went. It's been touring in New York, in Los Angeles. It's going to go to Europe. It's going to go to other cities, Boston, and I think maybe Miami. I don't know if it's going to other cities. It is gut-wrenching. It is not for the faint of heart, but I actually perversely encourage people to just gin up their courage if you have a possibility to see it. It's a remarkable exhibit, and it takes about maybe even 3 hours to walk through it properly, appropriately. And it's all actual artifacts that they salvage from the Nova Festival. It's almost solely about the Nova Festival, about the music festival. It's not a little bit about Be'eri and Kfar Aza and other communities. Yeah.
Jerry, can I say something, Yossi?
Yeah, Joe. Please. Hey, Yossi.
I hope I don't jump too early. Can we distinguish between the attack on October 7 against Israelis, which are Jews as well, or attack on Jews in other parts of the world? Because Israel, since its foundation, the Arab always threatened to slaughter us and throw us to the ocean. This has always been a given. Then all the wars and all the negotiations and trying to give them something and to make peace, and they didn't accept. They want all Israel. So this was something that we knew. We knew, but we didn't expect it to be like that. So can we think about that? We're talking about the rate of anti-Semite in the world in the last few years that went up 400%. That includes Jews, Israel, because we're all Jews. And but Israel is a unique case when you're talking about the Middle East, whatever you call it, massacre or attack.
So I think it's a good point, Yossi, and it's actually something to think about. Last week, I mentioned that Brett Stevens, who's written a very thoughtful, I think, critique or parallel to Israel Alone, paraphrased Levy, who said that the haven, the refuge, has now become, in some people's mind, a trap, a prison. That Dafka, the place that was supposed to save Jews from this kind of action, has, in some people's mind, become the opposite, has become a trap. I look, if people see it like that, it would be awful. I don't think so. But for a while, Israelis were saying, even after the Intifada, and you all know that that's when we were living there still, 01, 02, 03, even after terrible suicide bombings, even after the wars with Gaza and with Hezbollah in the north, Israelis, for the most part, said, listen, we're not talking about existential. We're not talking about, yes, we have many, many enemies still, but we're strong and we're vital and we have a powerful army. After October 7th, many Israelis, not just the doom and gloomers, but many have said, wow, we're refooling ourselves. And now, Dafka, the people outside of Israel are asking those questions with even more vehemence. In France, in the UK, in Australia, there's a documentary I just watched yesterday, an hour-long documentary about anti-Semitism in Australia. I've never been to Australia. I've always wanted to go. My first scuba instructor in Eilat was an Australian who talked about the Great Barrier Reef. One of our closest friends is a Jewish educator who comes from Australia. It's an open-minded, welcoming, wonderful country, and yet the anti-Semitism that's been promulgated just in the last year since October 7th, and even before that, has been some of the worst compared to even Western Europe. So people are asking, what the hell is this? Where can we go? And I'm glad you raised it, Yossi. I wanted to raise it again. I'm always curious now that I'm talking with parents and students and grandparents here and around the country. Are you feeling it? I mean, Cleveland is in some way a protected city, but I don't know, there's a difference between what we know and what we feel. Is this something that you're walking around with? And part of it has to do with, do you have children or grandchildren perhaps in other cities, college, other places that are, coming to grips with this?
Jerry, I'll say
Yes.
this. We have children or people that we know in other places. There's no escape from that. It's all over the place. We have to come to terms. We cannot deal with that by itself. Israel might be a mighty army, but we can't just think Israel army is going to solve the problem, where Israel has a lot of issues by itself. What I'm saying is we don't have to run away. We haven't done anything wrong to run away. So I even salute the young guys who went to Amsterdam for the soccer game, because the Arabs should hide, not we. And Europe, unfortunately, is infested with Arabs. France, England, Germany, Dutch, the Holland has been for years. Now, this is the situation. They're spread out there and they take advantage of the hospitality. And what can we do? Is protect ourselves. And now, maybe the US, we're the biggest ally. Again, it's a little hope that we have some kind of more help from the US. Now, I don't want to get into politics now, but there's no place. We don't have to run away. There's no place to run away. God created the world for all of us. Why should we be singled out? There must be something else. It may be jealousy.
I just want to, at least make a mention that when you said they're quote full of Arabs, and I'm not saying that this is what you meant, but I also think we have to be careful about saying Arabs when we're talking about Islamic fundamentalists, when we're talking about perhaps terrorists. I mean,
I know.
I think we have to distinguish.
No, Jerry, I know some, and I dealt with them, and I'm dealing with them here. There's good people from the Middle East. Muslims, doesn't matter, Muslim, Christian, Jews, civilized people. Israel is a democracy. Israel is the melting pot. A small country like Israel with 10 million population.
Yeah.
I don't have to tell you. We all know 20% of the Arabs enjoy Israeli citizenship, and they have wonderful Palestinian doctors who work in Israeli hospitals. So is in the clinic. I met lots of them for my work and other acquaintances. They're good people. They're good people. And I'm talking Middle East, could be Iraq, Syria, Egypt. I know them, Lebanese. There's good and bad. Okay? We are against the extremists. We have you're asking for a solution. I cannot tell you what a solution is. But we have a lot in common. If you talk about Israeli, because I'm an Israeli, we have a lot in common with those neighbors.
100%.
Same
No,
culture.
I'm not asking for a solution. I think that's above all of our pay grade. I'm wondering to what extent you all, I know most of you, and you know, we lived 18 winters in Cleveland. I have a great affection for the city and the Jewish community. I'm just wondering if you all, so connected to the community, does this feel different to you than it did before October 7th, or is just this quote unquote more of the same?
I think that it's different maybe on a macro level. If you're asking what any of us may, or any of our children perhaps may have personally experienced since this happened, I think it's a mixed bag. I don't think it's been all negative because there are people who have been sympathetic. Nobody's personally attacked me for being Jewish, and I don't feel like I have to hide a Magen David or a chai pendant or a kippah, at least here, at least so far. But you know, it's
You don't look
not
Jewish,
unlike what
David.
Yossi was saying. There are people out there, we can call them extremists if we want to, or Islamists, or whatever we want to call them. But I think the other factor is that there are some anti-Semites out there, you know, after World War II, and for a long time during our lifetimes, it was out of fashion to be out in the open.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of them are letting the extreme or Islamist kind of anti-Semitism do the dirty work while they kind of look on. You know, they're still there, so to speak. So it just reminds me of something I grew up with. And, you know, I don't think my mother was trying to scare us when she told us this, but she used to say that we were living in a blessed time or a golden time because after World War II, the anti-Semites were under a rock, but they're still under that rock, waiting to come out. And we Jews are big enough to be noticed and small enough to be easily attacked.
So I'm looking at everybody's face here. Forgive me. I'm looking at a certain generation, right? Within decades, but there aren't, I don't believe anybody 30 or under, or perhaps 40 and under. I'm wondering what are our children and grandchildren thinking? Are they also somewhat sanguine, even though they haven't seen the history that we all have seen or read the history that we've read? Or are they so connected to the college campus that they're dafka even more concerned? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Yes.
So I have a granddaughter who went to the Naval Academy, and then she's now graduating in December. She doesn't want to walk. She doesn't want us to come there. She was afraid to come. I'm an old lady. I went to the march that we went through Washington. She was afraid to go. She was afraid to say that she's Jewish, and she's not wearing anymore the Jewish symbols. To me, a second generation Holocaust survivor who was born in a DP camp, it's hurting me. There was always anti-Semitism in this country, in the Golden Medina of America. I felt it in higher education, in Cleveland Clinic, in UH, even though people say no, it's not existing, it is. That's why we had our own Mount Sinai, because the Jewish physician couldn't work in those institutions. So it was always under the surface. It's something happened in the last 20, 30 years. I don't know if it's the education, the lack of explanation to the younger generation. Most higher education, and that includes my children, unfortunately, became totally leftist to the point of extremes. They didn't see it at home. So my assumption is that they saw it in higher education, mainly in the area of Boston, the East Coast, and in California. I don't know if you have the same experience. I don't know how old your children are. I'm sure.
So yeah, in some way, our children are anomalous because they grew up in our house. They spent time in Israel.
So did mine. So did mine. And in spite of it, I saw this change and twisting in their ideology.
So a piece of it, I believe, as someone who loves history dearly, a student and a teacher of history, is this is nearly an ahistorical society. We don't teach history
Absolutely.
well.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about Gaza. Look, we all have a bit of a background, some more than others, but most of us are way ahead of the curve. And if you, if you reached out to the street out there just to an average citizen, we joke about it. Come on, they couldn't find Israel, much less Gaza, on a map.
Yeah.
They couldn't tell you any of the history. So I think that's one of the problems when we speak about Gaza and people talk about, oh, Israel has to withdraw from Gaza, and you tell them, no, guys, Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005. They think that you're making it up. Sheila wanted, go ahead. Well, hold on, you'll see Sheila.
What I think, when I think back about, my youth and even afterwards, we were afraid. There was anti-Semitism, and I grew up in New York in a Jewish neighborhood. I went to Hebrew school. Actually, it was not, Hebrew high school was not in a Jewish neighborhood, and that was the first time I ever heard the word kike. But before that, I didn't. But we knew there was anti-Semitism. It was the way people looked at you and talked to you, but you did not fear for your life in public. You didn't feel like someone's going to come with a stick and beat you. They might do it quietly, but you could walk around the city, and you can walk in neighborhoods that were not. My grandparents lived in a neighborhood, and around the corner, it was not Jewish. One street was Jewish, the next one you had the Goyim, and you were sort of leery of them, but you didn't expect them to come and shoot you. They might yell at you. They might be very nasty, say, curse you, but you didn't feel for your life. I don't think we felt for our lives as much.
Well, and I want to go to Jerry Brodsky, but remember also, not that long ago, there were gentlemen's agreements about whom you could sell a house to. Where we lived on Brainerd and Pepper Pike, it wasn't that long ago that there was a codicil that people could not sell to Jews. The reason why we have Mount Sinai's and Jewish hospitals is because our doctors weren't allowed to practice in the quote regular hospitals. The same thing, we opened up our own country clubs and our own golf courses and on and on. So while we weren't seeing things like Jim Crow with African Americans, there was plenty of anti-Semitism. It wasn't so out like it is now, with people getting punched and kicked and slashed in broad daylight. Jerry, wanted to ask
just say one thing along those lines. Cleveland Heights, Cleveland Heights and East Cleveland actually suffered because of that. Forest Hills development, which had all the nice ranch houses, modern and was colorful, that had restrictions. You couldn't sell to Jews.
That's Rockefeller. That was Rockefeller's property.
Yeah. So what happened is that the Jews moved out, and the blacks moved in, and East Cleveland is what it is now. But it wouldn't have been had they allowed Jews in that area.
Jerry, go ahead.
Jerry. So it just so happens that I did some research in the spring of 2023 about your question. I interviewed a dozen or so folks in different age groups, different parts of the country, as a part of a course I was taking on the politics of cultural and ethnic diversity. And the research was about the level of trust Jewish Americans have in the United States in terms of protecting them as it does other minorities, and whether that trust changed over the past 10 years. Well, last night, one of the interviewees said to me, "Hey, Jerry, are you going to follow up on that? Are you going to do another one post-October of 2023? Because I have to tell you, my responses to your questions would change." So I'm not going to tell you what I feel or what my grandkids might feel, but this research that I did at the time in the spring, the general consensus, the mean of these interviews was that the United States isn't going to be a government that puts us in danger, generally speaking, right? He's telling me, do it again, Jerry, because I think you're going to get different answers today. So the answer to your question is, the prediction I'd have is that things have changed since October.
I think it's fascinating, and I think many of us are familiar with the sociological literature that for people of color, for other minorities, the authorities, both governmental and law enforcement, were not seen as friendly. Primarily, I'm generalizing, but primarily for the Jews, they were seen as our protectors, right? In the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s. And now I would agree with Jerry that I think those answers would be very different now. Very different. Yes, there was somebody.
Jerry, I want to say a couple of words. We are a minority, right? But we are an affluent minority. In conjunction to what some other people say, why are we striking out? We are an affluent minority. We can blend in. A guy like me or you or David can blend in. Nobody knows you're Jewish. But you don't have to hide from that. You don't have to hide from Jews. I've never, and I'm here 50 years or so, I've never encountered, and I used to go to the YMCA in some other place, never encountered any remarks, the opposite. And I used to wear Star David. Okay, I don't want to say I'm Mr. Hero. But here's the thing. You know the story about the bully? The bully likes to prey on the weak. And the minute you run away and hide from him, he's going to keep running after you and beating the shit out of you. So you stand up to the bully, and one day you punch him back in the neck, in the nose. He won't do it again because he will not appreciate you. Now, when Israel did the last few months, start eating the Hamas, Hezbollah, Nasrallah, and Yahya Sinwar, and all these big shots in their place, and we show the world that we can reach them everywhere, including in downtown Tehran, which was really a slap on the face for them. Then, and I see it here in this neighborhood, wherever I go, among the Goyim would know me. They know I'm Israeli too, and Jewish. They have nothing but kavod, because now, what hurt me the most when there was in universities, when Jewish students had to hide in a closet when they chased them. I know it's fearful, when you face a mob, but you know what? Stand up for them. Stand up against them, and do some noise or whatever. I mean, the minute you're hiding, they look at you like a sheep who is hiding, and they can beat you up again. This is the mentality.
So yeah, look, I agree with you on one level, but frankly, for us to be able to say that is different than when there really is a mob of hundreds.
Yeah, I agree.
There's 2 or 3 or 5 Jewish
So we have
students.
to organize it to show the students how to respond, not by hiding, not by asking forgiveness and please don't hurt me, but standing up and say, what the heck are you? I mean, I can be, I'm just, I have this, you can bully me. It takes an education. Okay, that's all I can say.
Sheila, go ahead.
Jerry?
Yes. Oh, Sonia, sorry.
when I was in school, there were incidents. Now that same incident is a shooting.
Right.
It's become more violent. You know, I wasn't afraid of going to school. You know, somebody may have hit me, but they're not going to shoot me. Now, every time you pick up the newspaper, there's been another shooting.
So I don't want to over romanticize the past, because for some people the past was awful, but I think there's something to that. I've mentioned to a number of you, I was in high school in West Side Story, and I get a kick out of it now, thinking that it was written and produced in the 50s, and then the movie was in the 60s. And forget it was stylized dancing, Jerome Robbins choreography. It was still gangs, but by and large, they were gangs with clubs and maybe a knife, and right. And now, the armaments that people have on the street is completely different. I wanted to shift a little bit to talk about.
Can I just say something?
Yes. Who's talking?
I would like
to. Go ahead.
In the 1930s and 40s, there was a group called Murderers Inc., which was what would you say, a cooperation between the Italian mob and the Jewish,
right,
nice, not so nice people. Okay,
they were a mob. They weren't just not so nice.
Right.
The Jewish mob. Right.
The thing of it is that those were the people that stood up, and they they kneecapped people and they beat the hell out of them, and they didn't shoot them, and things settled down in cities all across the United States. This just was not isolated to one city or one community. Incidentally, on page 13 in the book, he uses the word massacre.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when I was defending that word by Webster, really, Levy uses the word
no, 100%.
as a massacre. And it was not a pogrom by the definition that you used, but really a massacre because it was cruel. And there's a big difference based on what he said. But the thing of it is that people that are bullies only understand if you show strength. And if you cower, they will continue to prevail.
So I think we also have to, like I said, I want to go back to Gaza in parts of the book, but we also have to be a little bit careful about this issue about bullies. On the playground, yes. Even certain geopolitical bullies, 100%. You show them force and oftentimes they back down. That only works if they're concerned for their own well-being. If they are not, then deterrence isn't the same thing. There was a book written in the 70s, Patai, the Arab Mind, and a lot of people castigated it because it seemed to be racist. Oh, what do you mean the Arab mind? The Arabs have the same mind as everyone else. What the author was saying was that there are cultural differences. It doesn't say that, oh, they don't care about life. That's just absurd. But they care about life, and even saying they is problematic. But certain people care about life in different ways. So when Iran and Iraq fought a terrible, terrible war, and hundreds of thousands died, and the Iranians used 12 and 13 and 14-year-old boys to physically, literally clean minefields, people said they don't care about human life. I think that's going too far. They may not care as perhaps the Western liberal mind does, and that's the problem. You can't use that mutually assured destruction, MAD, really worked in the Cold War, because at the end of the day, even though we were ideological enemies, the Soviets didn't want to be destroyed. So deterrence worked. Deterrence, or fighting back against a bully, is not going to work when they don't care as much as you care about getting hurt. Look, Hamas and Sinwar really didn't care, frankly, how many Palestinian children were going to be killed. They just didn't. They won when Jewish children died and when Palestinian children died, right? They were tucked into the tunnels deep below the earth. They were getting food and water and whatnot. At the end of the day, American pundits didn't understand it when they said, oh, why aren't they stopping? These are their people. No, they think ideologically they're winning if Palestinian children are killed. So in a weird, twisted way, that thing about fighting against a bully might work if you can deter and degrade their army, but it's not going to work in the same way as, oh, a bully gets punched in the nose and then stops. Let's go to Gaza a little bit. Well, let's not go there for a long time. But everyone should know when we're talking about Gaza, it's a lousy 140 square miles. It's nothing for those, acquainted with metric system. It's about 380 square kilometers. In 2017, the population was 1.9 million. Last year, it's assumed to be 2.2 million. It's very, very, very dense. After the Ottomans, right? The Ottomans ruled for 500 years approximately. World War I, their rule ended. It became part of the League of Nations mandate, and the Brits had mandatory control over Gaza. In 47, when the UN promulgated the partition plan to say, here's a piece of pre-state Palestine for the Jews, here's one for the Arabs, the Gaza part was part of the Arab state. The mandate ended May 15th when Israel, issued its independence proclamation. And when the war began in 48, the Egyptian army entered by the way, there's a town of Gaza. Now we say Gaza City, but in those days, in 47, there was actually a town called Gaza that we get that name. So the Egyptian army came into the town of Gaza. There was very heavy fighting between the Egyptian army and the Israeli army. The area around the town was occupied by the Egyptians, and it was reduced to a small strip, right? The Gaza Strip, 25 miles by 4.5 miles. Very, very tiny, just a tiny little nothing. The boundaries were made official between Egypt and Israel because of the armistice. And remember in 49, after the war, there was no peace treaty, right? Because Egypt wouldn't sign a peace treaty with Israel, but they did sign an armistice agreement. So after 49, Gaza was controlled by Egypt. It was controlled by the Egyptian military between 49 and 56. And then you all know 56 was the Sinai campaign, where Egypt and the French and the Brits in cooperation stormed into Sinai. It was a magnificent military victory, but the Soviets and the US came down hard on Israel and on the Brits and on the French in the UN and said, nothing doing, back off. And of course, Israel had to back off. So right after that, Egypt seized control back, was given control again of Gaza, of the Strip. And between 56 and 67, they had full control. During that time, extreme poverty, large numbers of Palestinian refugees were there, and they were kept as refugees. You probably all know that the Palestinians are the only ones with quote unquote permanent refugee status in the UN. So it's unbelievable. Egypt never considered the Strip as part of Egypt, and they didn't allow the Palestinians to become Egyptian citizens. They didn't want them. I hear a lot when I used to do this with the CRC. I was the community's korban on panels and debates, and people said, well, why don't the Arabs take them in? They're brothers and sisters. They don't want them. I mean, they really don't want them. There's no love lost between Palestinians and Egyptians, Palestinians and Lebanese, Palestinians and Syrians. So the Egyptians up until 67 wanted them not to become Egyptian citizens, or they also didn't want them to migrate to other Arab communities, other Arab nations, to cause problems. So they were kind of stuck. The news, the media, elected officials, the people who really don't know their history, they keep saying, well, why doesn't Israel do something? Why doesn't it? They could equally say, why doesn't Egypt do something? But they don't. So 67 was a six-day war. It was the topic of my thesis in graduate school. So I won't bore you with the details, but we all know that after 67, Israel didn't want the war, but after Fedayeen raids from the south and Kadushas from the north, and the blocking of the Straits of Tiran and on and on. Oh, and Nasser saying we're going to throw you into the sea, and Nasser telling the UN under Utant to get the hell out of Sinai. And they said, okay, boss, we'll do it. For all those reasons, Israel preemptively struck in June of 67. And then one territory, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, right? So 67 through 05, Israel had control of the Strip. In 87, there were riots between the Palestinians and the IDF. That was the quote-unquote first intifada, which means shaking off. 94, those of us who remember, that was a kind of a heady time. And, looking back, we were so optimistic. That was the time of the White House handshake on the White House lawn, the quote unquote DOP, the Declaration of Principles between Israel and the PLO. It was when Rabin, who looked like he would have been anywhere else gladly, Clinton kind of pushed his hand and he shook hands with Arafat under the Oslo Accords. That was in the 90s. Then, of course, the second intifada happened, 2000 to 05. Arik Sharon in 03 announced the plan to withdrawal. And in 05, all of Israel withdrew from Gaza. Not just the army, but settlements as well. And some of the settlements were there since 67. They had chamamot, hot houses, and kibbutzim, and very successful. And they turned all those over to the Palestinians, and unfortunately, they were destroyed. They could have had the beginning of an economy, a wonderful economy, and they said nothing doing, and it was destroyed. The control transferred to the PA, to the Palestinian Authority, and Israel continued to patrol the border and the airspace, and Egypt patrolled the Philadelphia corridor between Gaza and Egypt. In 06, I'm just racing through this to give us the same history. In 06, the PA had parliamentary elections, and Fatah lost to Hamas. So the US and the EU threw sanctions on Hamas. In June of 07, there was a short-lived coalition government between the PA and Hamas that ended very quickly. Hamas took control. There were a number of attempts to reconcile, but essentially in 2019, the unity government ended. Hamas always had full control. So that's the backdrop. Hamas has had control. Israel has been out of Gaza since 05. Egypt cooperated with Israel on the border closure. So Egypt and Israel have had very good military to military relations. Even when it's been a cold peace, they've cooperated with each other, police to police, military to military. I'm not telling any big secrets, but she would still probably be upset with me. But when Nomi was in the army, one of her portfolios was dealing with the Egyptian military about things that were happening. Who knows? They could have been smugglers in Sinai. They could have been other things. But the Israeli military and the Egyptian military, they always spoke together in English, of course, cooperated a lot. There was because it was to each of their benefit to maintain some control over the Strip. This is important. In 2018, Israel eased the restrictions on the blockade. Qatar, some people call it Qatar, I don't understand that, but Qatar gave tens of millions of dollars in aid. By 2021, Qatar had given $400 million in aid to Hamas for Gaza. We all know where that aid went. It didn't go to schools, it didn't go to hospitals, it didn't go to mosques, it went to the tunnels, it went to rockets. And remember 2014, the 3 Israelis, young people were kidnapped. There was a 50-day offensive between Israel and Gaza. 2,100 Palestinians and 70 Israelis were killed. So that's the backdrop to all this. Gaza is a national trauma. Israelis and Jews, we've lived with generational trauma. We still talk about our trauma having been slaves in Egypt, for God's sakes. We talk about Yom HaShoah, about the Shoah, the quote-unquote Holocaust. This has added to Israel's and to Jewish national trauma. Let me pause for a minute. There was some, yeah, go ahead, Sheila.
A group of us went into Gaza in 1972. We were on the border. We were on the border, and we told the driver he's telling us all about Gaza. He said, let's go in. He said, well, we shouldn't. And he warned us, we're going in. It took us a half hour in, a half hour out. We went to the edge of Gaza City. He told us, no bathroom stops, no heart attacks. We're not stopping. And we went in, and the place was barren until you got close to the city, to Gaza City. There were a couple of Bedouins, well, not Bedouins, they were Arab women who looked at us, just stared at us. And we went quickly in and out, but there was nothing there. There were no greenhouses. It was, at least at the point in which we went in. I have a picture somewhere, but I just can't retrieve it.
So what's interesting is, Dafka, I was there also in 72 and was there for a year before leaving right before the war, a month before the war. And 73, if you could do the math, that was Israel's 25th anniversary. And Israel was on top of the world. They had beaten the combined armies in 67. They were flying high economically, militarily. There were jet flyovers. There was a military parade, kind of like what you see in North Korea. Tanks and soldiers marching. There was the Bar-Lev line between the Sinai and Israel, and everybody thought, oh, come on, we can't be defeated. We're so tough. We're so strong. And of course, that amount of arrogance and hubris helped lead to Egypt crossing the Sinai and the Syrians crossing the Golan. In the end, the 73 war was an amazing military victory, but it cost Israel dearly, and it made them think that we shouldn't always be so confident. And of course, before October of 23, there was also an overabundance of confidence, which led to that. Yes, Yossi.
You mentioned all these good things about the history of the area of Gaza, but I would like to take you back to the time that Ariel Sharon, who used to be a hero of mine, and the guy is a fighter, toward the end of when he was already in frail health, he decided to give back Gaza to Hamas. Mm-hmm. That was a very tough decision for him, for a guy like that. He finally said, we don't need it. We don't need that headache. It's about Gaza, like you said, 25 miles long, 4 miles wide, was like Doha, 10 times Doha, I think, in Qatar. So he said, give it back to them. Soon as we gave back Gaza, we gave him the key. He said, you're on your own. What did Hamas do? They threw PLO, their own brothers, from the towers, butchered them, and took Hamas. Now, why couldn't the PLO, not only the Egyptians don't want to do anything with the Palestinians, why doesn't the PLO and the West Bank do something together? This is one people. Why does Israel have to do all that?
We'll talk about that. But by the way, when Arik Sharon decided to withdraw, it wasn't Hamas. It was the Fatah and the PLO who was in charge. That changed very quickly, right? But at that time, he thought, number one, we shouldn't be in charge of at that time, about 1.5 million Palestinians. Nobody wants it. It's a mess. And number two, it was Fatah, and he thought, rightly or wrongly, that they were going to be able to be in charge. There was, in essence, a civil war between the Palestinians. Hamas won, Fatah lost. And what happened was that the fundamentalists took over. Like Fatah or not, there's a very big difference between Fatah and Hamas. And Hamas was a direct line, even though they're Sunni, direct line to Iran. I want to ask a question, though, that the book asks really poignantly.
By the way, Jerry.
Yes.
All the shame of it all is that Gaza, the piece of land, is a beautiful piece of land on the Mediterranean.
Right.
And they could have a tourist. It's just like Lebanon. This is beach country. They could have tourism there and be rich. And
so just like Beirut used to be called, this is going back 30 years, quote, they used to call it the Paris of the Middle East, right? And now it's just a nightmare. The same thing with Gaza could have been, extraordinary if all those millions, hundreds of millions of dollars went into infrastructure instead of tunnels and rockets. It could have been a completely different story. I don't know why the media doesn't say that story. Yeah.
Because the media doesn't even want to understand that story, for better or worse. But let me ask a question that, just to bring in another angle on this, because there's an understanding that many of us have that Hamas is an organ, if you will, or a brother organization of the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think he refers to that in the book, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
So the Muslim Brotherhood during the so-called Arab Spring comes to power in Egypt, and then Sisi overthrows them.
Right.
So whatever Sisi says in public, one has to imagine, given what he's been doing over time that nobody pays any attention to in the Western media, to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, that he would be glad to have Hamas slaughtered by Israel so he doesn't have to do it himself. Could you comment on that and maybe elucidate?
So it makes me think about Vietnam when LBJ and others, when we're talking about Lee Duc Tho in South Vietnam, not a good guy. I mean, so not a good guy. And the phrase in Washington was, well, he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. So the same thing, that al-Sisi in Egypt is ruthless, is absolutely, a dictator in his own right. But he was anti the Muslim Brotherhood because the Muslim Brotherhood has its foundations in Egypt going back almost a century, and he knows that they were going to wrest control, when Morsi was elected as president. So he said nothing doing. So that he knew damn well. The Arabs know the Arab street really well. That's one of the reasons why the Arab Spring didn't take over, because they know what's going to happen. They knew that, what happened with Hamas was going to happen with the Brotherhood in Egypt. So he said nothing doing, even though they had a kind of fair-ish election, and he took control. And the United States, frankly, was okay about this. You don't hear a lot of people, because like Lee Duc Tho in South Vietnam, he's our SOB. So we could work with him. Frankly, Israel could work with him because they had common, issues and alliances. He doesn't want al-Sisi. He doesn't want a resurgent Hamas in Egypt or Brotherhood, and neither does Israel. So they could, come together on that. The same thing in other areas. For that matter, they both cooperated because they didn't want an ISIS resurgent in Sinai. So there are common issues whereby Egypt and Israel can work together. The same thing in Jordan. Why did Jordan grant airspace for Israel to do flyovers to Iran? There's no love lost between the Shia in Iran and the Sunni nations in Jordan and Egypt. So it makes perfect sense. It sounds cynical, it is, but they have common enemies. So the last thing they want is a resurgent Hamas. That's why when Egypt plays that role as a quote unquote mediator, they're not doing it because they love Israelis. They're doing it because they don't want Hamas to get bigger and stronger than they are. You notice, by the way, when people yell at Israel saying, oh, come on, man, let the Palestinians in Gaza come to work in Israel. Almost no one is saying, come on, Egypt, let your brothers come into Egypt. They're not going to do it. It's just a non-starter. I want to ask, what time is it? Oh, okay. So this is something from the from the first chapter, very powerful. This is when he first got to the Gaza envelope. Afterward, I met with families of the hostages, and they reminded me of the parents of Gilad Shalit, whom I had visited nearly 2 decades before in a similar house. I pictured Ruth and Judea, the parents of Daniel Pearl. Everyone knows he worked for the Wall Street Journal and was decapitated, whom I met in Encino, California, in the early stages of the investigation, in which I retraced the steps of the young Jewish journalist who had been abducted and subsequently beheaded. I reconstructed his last days and got as close as I could to the Al-Qaeda jihadists who had murdered him so brutally. In all of these families, the same distress, the same shock, the same difficulty in finding the right words to describe the situation. And when the words came, the same expressions. We who survive, again, survivors, are ready to give everything, absolutely everything, even our own lives, to bring back a child kidnapped without his baby bottles, like the baby in Gaza, if he's still alive. A sister seen on the media, half naked, bloodied, thrown like a package into a pickup, or a grandmother whom the abductors gave no time to say goodbye to her beloved. So it goes over and over and over again, and it asks the question, should there be prisoner exchanges? And thank God none of us have to make that decision. But Debbie and I talk about this all the time. Our friends in Israel here talk about this. Those 100,000 people who are marching and demonstrating in rallies in Tel Aviv in Hostage Square are saying, do anything to bring back our hostages. I'm just curious, as a group with, like I said, thankfully none of us have the power or the responsibility of making that decision. We used to say all the time, oh, Israel doesn't negotiate with terrorists. That's a national fiction. They do, we do, the West does. We like to say we don't, but of course we do. In the past, they've given up hundreds and hundreds of prisoners for 1 or 2 or 3, not even alive, but 1 or 2 or 3 Israeli bodies sometimes. I'm just curious what you all think. So if you had that decision to make, would you say we should exchange prisoners?
First of all, I'm going to say I'm pretty glad I don't have that decision to make. Talk about above one's pay grade. And then I'm going to offer something that isn't really an answer. So we have a longstanding tradition of ransoming hostages, and we certainly value the life of every hostage. So if we say we do and we don't do anything, or we don't seem to do enough because there's still so many of them there, it feels like a real problem. On the other hand, the leaders of this pogrom or massacre or whatever we want to call it, some of them, including, I think, Sinwar, were in Israeli custody, yes, and were traded or exchanged in previous exchanges. And look what that resulted in. So it seems harder after October 7th to ransom hostages in the same way. And so I just gave a non-answer, but that seems to be what we're all struggling with in our own heads, and we don't even have the decision.
And David's right. Sinwar was infamously exchanged in one of the prisoner swaps. And when he was in Israeli prison, he learned Hebrew quite well. And he's a perfect example of, the devil comes back to haunt you when you make a devil's bargain.
Jerry.
Saved him.
What's that?
They saved him physically with the brain operation.
Yeah. Yossi?
Jerry, it's a tough decision. As Jews, we value every life, like David said. Morally, it's a big issue in Israel. From the very beginning, I remember, the very beginning of the war, we got to get the hostages out. Now, we don't know what's the situation with them today after so many months, but still, doesn't matter, dead or alive, we need to get them. But I'm not going to make a decision here. But here's what I'm going to say. There's a lot of politics involved on the Israeli part and the US part. Could have been done differently, but I'm not going to get into politics. You draw the conclusion, you know enough. I'm talking about the Israeli part, the Israeli government, a lot of politics. So they prolonged the war and everything was going on like that. Now I'm saying at this point, and I'm going to make a statement. Lucky for Israel, we have Trump in the White House. Now, people might be against me. Wait till after January 20. Iran is going to pay for it. The Khomeini is going to go down. This is my prediction. You can write it down. And Hamas is already on the last legs. We just need to find a solution for the movement of Hamas. Hamas is not only an army; it's a gangsters. It's a gang, but it's a what do you call it? A movement, like the Nazis got in Shimam. You got to re-educate the people. So Hamas is out. Hezbollah is already suffered, and Iran is going to pay for it. Now, what's after that? It depends. We need to really have a good government in Israel that can do things in a better way. That's all I can say. But we have to bring the hostages back. It's a mission that you don't, it's a must.
Well,
but we cannot exchange it for prisoners.
Well, and as David said, Pinyan Shvuim, the redemption of the captives, they were talking about this during the days of the Mishnah, right? So we have that embedded in our psyche. And during the Middle Ages, communities were giving whatever gold they had, to repatriate captives. This puts that in a completely different context because we know that the people who are being repatriated are some of the worst. They didn't get picked up for pickpocketing and jaywalking. These are murderers. These are people, who have committed heinous crimes. And I don't understand, Debbie and I talk about this all the time. Where is this written that the ratio is 100 to 1, 200 to 1? What the hell? How can the people who create these crimes, who finally most of the world, not all, says, look what they did, get to dictate terms, right? It's mind-numbing. But that's what's part of it. I want to make sure that we're also talking about how, like I said, in a very short book, Levi lays out things really clearly. Hamas completely fooled Israel. Most of us, I don't want to assume, but I'd say, all right, that all of us are proud of what Israel's military does, Israel's intelligence. We think about Entebbe. We think about, what Israel has done to defeat hijackers. Amazing. Even right recently with the cell phones and the walkie-talkies, unbelievable. But arrogance also leads to blindness and overconfidence, like it did in 73. And so what did Sinwar, who evidently was a brilliant strategist, what did he do? First, he took in hundreds of millions of dollars, and he encouraged construction of five-star hotels here, like Sheila was saying, along the beach. He also presided over the construction of beaches and piers. He allowed universities, colleges, and restaurants and clubs to flourish. He was doing all this, and even when there were border incursions, the retaliation from Hamas was really, quote unquote, minor. He was trying as best he could, and he was successful at signaling that they just want to get along. And he was trying to build up his own persona as being a pragmatic moderate. So either he was really, really good at it, or Israel / Bibi really, really wanted to believe it. And of course, it's understood that Bibi, in also a cynical fashion, wanted to prop up Hamas and Sinwar as a lever against Mahmoud Abbas and the PLO in the West Bank. So everyone was playing their own cynical game. Sinwar was playing pronouns are complicated. I'll say us, what the hell. Playing us and Israel for fools, kind of giving them what they wanted to hear. And Bibi was kind of falling into that trap because he wanted to, push against the PLO by leveraging Hamas. And in some way, he fooled Israel, Sinwar, because they wanted to be fooled. There were press conferences. There were all sorts of things where he put on a pragmatic, quote unquote, moderate, that's a relative term, moderate persona. And what Levy uses is, I think, a brilliant passage where he says that this wasn't just Israel. Frankly, democracies allow themselves to be fooled. So this is what he wrote. It's in the second chapter. That truth is the eternal propensity of democracies, when faced with unthinkable barbarity, to know without believing, to possess data without drawing conclusions. It's the logic of Edgar Allan Poe's Purloined Letter, lying on the table with scarcely a wrinkle, but so obvious that no one takes any notice. It is, in other words, hidden in plain sight. I love those two paragraphs. I had to read them a couple of times, but what he's saying is that everyone could see what this guy was capable of, and yet we allowed ourselves, Israel allowed ourselves, with all its intelligence and the Mossad and the Shin Bet and the military intelligence, which is separate, with all their vaunted eyes in the sky and everything else, they were allowed to be fooled. And we were given the information that we thought we wanted to say, oh, come on, man, they're pragmatic. They want to build, universities and piers and restaurants and clubs. We just need to bring more of them into. So what happened? They allowed more of them coming into Israel to be guest workers, thinking that that's all they wanted. What were they doing in, of all places, those kibbutzim that lean left? They were taking notes about where the shomrim, where the guards were, and they were looking at where the cameras were, and they were casing the joint, and then coming back, and then having exercises with paragliders and with motorcycles to know exactly where to attack, when to attack, and how to break through the fences. So in some way, it was a brilliant stratagem, and it caught Israel flat-footed because it gave them exactly what they wanted.
So Jerry,
we just have 10 minutes. Yes.
Yeah, I want to, when I read that, I partially, maybe mostly agreed with it, but I have a different angle that I just have to throw out here, which is one of the differences between an autocracy, if you will, and a democracy is that the people who elect the leaders in a democracy are the same people whose children, or themselves for that matter, would be the ones who would go to war. And an autocrat doesn't have to care. So Putin wants to do the usual Russian strategy of throwing bodies at his perceived enemy to try to win the war, however many Russians have to die, or now North Koreans. That's different than somebody in the West, for example, Attlee Chamberlain, or maybe it's the same at the moment with before October 7th with the Israelis. I don't want to make an absolute parallel because I don't have enough information to do that with absolute assurance, but I'm just offering that although a lot of what he says is true, he seems to be leaving out the factor that, let's say Israeli intelligence is telling the government, these are some things that we should be worrying about. Possibly the government is saying to itself, things seem okay right now. This is very troubling intelligence, but I have here from Herr Sinwar a piece of paper, or so to speak. Can you actually start something preemptive in Gaza?
Right.
Maybe you think twice now. Boy, hindsight being 2020, what could we have prevented if we'd done something preemptive? But what would the West have said if we'd done something preemptive? What would our allies, the United States, say if we'd done something preemptive? Did we have enough evidence to show them? Would they have believed it? So I'm just offering that as a modification anyway.
But it's not a question of preemptive.
What's that, Sheila?
It's not a question of preempting anything. It's a question is that we didn't prepare ourselves. The people on the kibbutz, the whole area, they were not prepared just in case this would happen. That's where it fell down.
And in some way,
fair too.
Right. I think that's fair. And in some way, this is some of the lead up to 73. Golda was told, by Washington, don't you dare. Don't you, 67 was one thing. You can't get away with it again. So what's interesting is that what Israel did with the Hezbollah in Lebanon was partly, from what I can read in public sources, partly because they did see that something else was going to happen. So they nipped it in the bud and they got all kinds of flack for it. And, after a while, they're going to say, oh, yeah, tough, because they really decimated Hezbollah's leadership and their CNC, their command and control. Brilliantly, they also took out most of the surface to air installations and the early warnings in Iran to soften them up if they have to go in again. So, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, blah, 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 especially within the same year. I don't think Israel was going to stand for it, even if they knew they were going to get flack from the US and from the West. So look, the next time I want to go into, we're only at chapter 3. He has something called Amalek's Bath, which I think is brilliant. He talks about the differences between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, which we're going to go into. The question about evil, philosophical evil, and some of the references to what happened after October 7th in this country, where progressives, right, the people who believe women, all of a sudden didn't believe women because they were Israeli women and they were Jewish women who had been raped and murdered. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and then go into eventually, I want to circle back because I need some wisdom about, okay, what the hell do we do with this? So I'm going to push you guys into helping me come up with an answer.
Jerry?
Yes.
One suggestion, there was a speaker at B'nai Jeshurun who was in the United States. He was a general in the Israeli army. And one comment that he made was that Hamas preemptively struck because they were planning to do it with Lebanon and Iran. And had he waited, those two countries would have joined in and it would have been annihilation.
You're talking about Hezbollah, not Hamas?
Yes.
Yes.
So
yes. Yes.
If you have time, it was at the end of services.
Okay.
And I found it very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, look, that's in keeping. And as far as what Yossi had said about Iran, look, the Ayatollah is 86, 87, I think, something like that. And you know, the thing about dictators, whether they're in North Korea or Moscow or Tehran, they're not really big on succession planning. So we don't know if there's somebody in line, who that person is. They're really in disarray. The sanctions have hurt, maybe not enough, but they have. So they're not in a good place. So it may be the time to hope that something will happen. The best thing would be internally. I'm not holding my breath. That would be an amazing thing, a reversal of the 79 revolution. But it may be with the new administration that Yossi's right, that somehow either Israel and or the U.S. and or in concert with the U.S., helps to move things along, quote unquote, in Iran. At any rate, it's 5:58, or for you, it's 8:58.
8:58.
Thank you guys. This is always really illuminating to me. It's an
Yasher
amazing
Koah.
book. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, I
Have a
just
good-
wanted to add that I looked on the website and the exhibit, the Nova exhibition, the only other place that seems to be traveling in the US is Miami, at least
Okay.
for now.
Okay. Well, it's extraordinary. We talked to people who put it together. They said they're actually bringing it to Europe. I'm glad. I'm surprised, and I can't imagine what kind of security they're going to have. But they need to do that. At any rate, if you ever get a chance, as hard as it is, you should try to see it. So have a good Shabbat. I'll see you guys on Thursday.